Today's video game review is Life is Strange. Life is Strange is an adventure game starring Max Caulfield, a slightly introverted and shy teenager who dreams of one day becoming a photographer. She's just moved back to her hometown recently in order to attend Blackwell Academy in order to fulfill that dream of hers. However, school life isn't so easy, as she has to deal with the bullying and harassment of her peers, as well as not being particularly confident in her photographing abilities. The game starts with her having a vision of a horrific tornado incident occurring in town. However, she's woken up soon afterwards and realizes it must have all simply just been a dream. Later on, when she finds herself in the woman's restroom, she catches sight of a blue butterfly. Her photography skills kick in and she snaps a photo, cueing that these kind of scenes are something the player can look for in the photograph for themselves. While shortly after, another student by the name of Nathan Prescott enters the bathroom while having some sort of a mental breakdown. Almost immediately after that, another teenage girl enters and both proceed to have a massive argument. Unfortunately, this ends with Nathan pulling a gun and shooting the girl, which seemingly instantly kills her. However, by some stroke of fate, as Max witnesses all of this, she quickly finds soon after that she has been granted the power to manipulate time. After doing a bit of trial and error and verifying her powers to be indeed real, she then springs into action and uses them to her advantage in order to save the mysterious girl. Though unbeknownst to her at the time, this might not be the last time she'll be having to use this set of powers. So Life is Strange is essentially a mystery story with some supernatural elements. There are two main plot threads going on throughout the adventure. The first is fairly compelling and interesting, which would be the circumstances surrounding the disappearance of Rachel Amber, Max's best friend Chloe's best friend while Max was away. I probably could have worded that better, but shut up. While the mystery itself is actually fairly predictable, how the characters around you get involved in this is what makes it sort of work. The other plot thread involves a vision of the tornado that will supposedly destroy the town of Arcadia Bay, and in my honest opinion, should have been left out of the game entirely, as it comes off as a desperate attempt to make cheap drama that really has nothing to do with the ongoing mystery that the game mainly centers on, but I'll discuss that in further detail later. The plot is pretty slow moving, but nowhere as bad as most visual novels that I've read, so it's hard for me personally to complain. And overall, it's really nothing to write home about thanks to a, frankly, terrible ending in my eyes. The characters, however, fare a bit better, and are really the main thing that makes the game shine at all, because I most certainly didn't get much out of the story or gameplay. What I liked the most was that certain characters, like say Frank, are full of faults and are pretty much criminals in the eyes of society, but the game allows them to not always just be mean-spirited or juvenile, and even seem passionate and kind when the time comes. A stark contrast to what I'm normally used to, as usually once a guy is established as a crook of sorts, they can only make negative choices. It makes them come across as a touch more human than most in this game. As for our main cast, I'll be covering more on them later, but I'll say it's a bit half and half. I really liked Kate, David, and Frank, but couldn't really get by Max and Chloe or some of the other characters. Though Max's problem for me comes more from a game design issue. The side characters you can interact with didn't seem too awful or anything, but none of them really stood out for me either, and I'm sure I'll find myself quickly forgetting every last one of them. What drags the characters down quite a bit is the writing. It just feels like the author is trying way too hard to be quirky and hip, which makes for not only awkward conversations, but some awkward deliveries from the voice acting. Though I get the author wanted to have a mix of lighthearted and more serious moments in order for the game to not seem so monotonous. And in that regard, I think he did well, but really, he needs to work on the comedy more than anything, as the more serious moments fare much better if you ask me. Musically, I don't really remember the music other than the main menu music. Mostly the game is willing to be quiet and let the ambience do the work, which is something that I can support because it would allow the game to be more atmospheric. And certainly, I never felt like the soundscape got repetitive, so that's a definite plus. As for the voice acting, it's a bit all over the place. Some of it is really great, like Mr. Jefferson, Chloe's family in general, outside of David as he's a tad too goofy.
Oh no!
Frank, and most of the adults in general. Warren and Victoria aren't bad either. However, then a lot of the teenagers and side characters just either come across as incredibly green, or just plain awkward. I can tell Max is trying, but her delivery just lacks passion and emotion most of the time, and is full of awkward moments. She does get slightly better overall as the episodes go on, but she also gets a hell of a lot more breathy as well, making her sound silly rather than emotional. But it's not a huge deal, and in comparison, it's certainly a lot better than what I heard out of Telltale's The Walking Dead. Visually, I do think the game is very appealing looking mostly, and very well directed overall in terms of camera direction, in the cutscenes and whatnot. However, one thing that really hurts is how stiff the faces are and how awkward conversations seem, as they suffer from the same fixed eye contact that BioWare games have. It really does ruin some of the moments when the characters just have these blank, creepy, doll-like stares on. Granted, I know it's not like the game had the budget of The Last of Us to include all those subtle facial nuances, but maybe having lower graphical prowess for more expressive faces would have been a better alternative. Gameplay-wise, it's an adventure game with very simple puzzles. All I have to say is games like this make me realize why people like Zelda so much still, as the puzzles are generally uncreative outside of a few cool scenes, and overall just feel like they're tossed in there most of the time. The dialogue conversations fare much better, which is fitting considering this is a far more narrative-driven experience than gameplay. It's a tad difficult to explain, but essentially you can talk to people and gain information based on choices you make. However, if they let something slip out that they didn't mean to say, you can reverse time and re-engage in the conversation with your newly acquired knowledge, which will leave people usually stumped and have no choice but to relinquish any further knowledge that they can possibly give you. It's a simple system, but it's nifty enough, and the characters' reactions are generally entertaining, and it gives you good reason to pay attention to what they are saying. I guess the main thing to ask in terms of the gameplay is, did this narrative-driven experience actually benefit from being a game? Or was it better off as, say, a kinetic story or TV show? Well, without spoilers, I can say the gameplay aspect serves to disappoint more than add by the end of it all, but while playing and without that knowledge, through the game you're given some particularly heavy choices, which will add a bit of weight for a lot of people, and certainly for me and my girlfriend while we were playing, that you wouldn't get from a TV series. Overall, Life is Strange ends up a bit flat. It certainly has its entertaining moments, and some of the characters are decent enough, but they weren't enough to carry the game for me. Granted, it's not a terribly long game, so I don't feel like I had wasted too much time on it either. Therefore, I'm not too bitter about spending my time with it. Now it's time to get into spoiler territory, so if you haven't finished the game, and I mean all 5 episodes, then you probably don't want to listen past here. Unless you're of course just curious, then I guess go ahead, but beware! In episode 1 of Life is Strange, I have to say I found the very start of it rather painfully slow, but I could see that it was mainly just exposition and setup. At the very least, the game did a good job of having Max's reactions probably reflecting the player in the use of her powers. So if the game was trying to get us to relate to Max's circumstances, then kudos on a job well done. However, one thing I didn't care much for was the entire swarm of characters it was introducing to us all at once, most of which played little actual significance in the plot of the game, and therefore I find myself struggling to remember a few of them and who they were. The main reason the game designers probably did this was to get you a nice comfortable playground to test your time manipulation powers out and see how dialogue plays out between characters. In that sense, I guess it's fine, but it doesn't take away from the fact that it still took a long time introducing characters I couldn't even care to remember. Plus, it gives you the wrong impression that interacting with them will have a deeper impact in the end game, but I think I should save discussing that for later. Anyway, after saving Chloe and interacting with all the students, visiting your dorm and doing basically nothing, you finally head to the parking lot to talk to your friend Warren, who has a huge crush on Max. However, once again, Nathan Prescott strikes to interrupt the conversation and shows you that he means business. Thankfully, you're soon saved by Chloe, who happened to be the girl that you saved earlier from Nathan in the bathroom. I'd like to mention this part because I had to think long and hard if Chloe really did anything useful, and this is one of the few moments I could think of because for the rest of the game, she'll be doing mostly nothing while Max solves all the problems at hand. The two drive back towards Chloe's house as the two chat about days long past. For some reason, Max never sent many messages towards Chloe while she was away, and Chloe is rather bitter at Max because of this, but isn't necessarily completely mean-spirited towards her, at least at this point. Though later on, she'll continue to get bitchier, whinier, and a hell of a lot more selfish. which is funny because it seems like she'd be the proactive and strong one of the two, but instead is the more dependent and weak-hearted person. This is because of a couple of reasons. One, her father, from whom she was very close to, died shortly before the time when Max had moved away. Second, Max, her best friend, had moved away from her. 3, her mother got remarried to a stubborn war veteran by the name of David. And 4, her new best friend, which could arguably be seen as her replacement for Max, Rachel Amber, has gone missing. As a consequence, she's now the selfish, juvenile troublemaker you'll be made clear of for the rest of the game. Even in the sections where she's acting friendly towards Max in the game, I always felt like none of it felt very sincere, because she would quickly turn cold against Max the second you chose for Max to not abide by her every whim. Though due to the knowledge of her past, at least her attitude is completely justified and sympathetic to a degree. However, even though she's the most complex character, I can't honestly say she's very well written in terms of working for the story. This is because of that problem I mentioned earlier, that while she is given various flaws, she's given hardly any positives or strengths. Even her being proactive isn't much of a strength because Max basically has to do pretty much everything for her, and really, it only serves to get her in trouble. Having a flawed character is great, but it only really works if Max was equally flawed and was without strengths like her. Otherwise, it just makes her seem pathetic in comparison. Max, on the other hand, though, might have some worse issues because she's the main character of an adventure game, and they decided to give her an actual personality. Of course, you might ask what the problem with that is. Well, you see, if Max has her own personality, then it's very odd for us in a narrative-driven experience to be making all these choices for her. Otherwise, as a character, she comes across as someone with no will of her own, and it's more just a puppet for me to toy around with.
It makes her predictable, and any decisions and emotions she has hard to take seriously, considering at times you can make polar opposite choices for her.
Granted, this goes for a lot of adventure games, but I'm just saying. This is why, despite complaints about them, silent protagonists can be a good thing. They aren't so great in games without heavy emphasis on choices, but in a game that is, we have to assume we are essentially Max herself. And from a storytelling point of view, if we are to make choices for her, that means there can't be any real build-up for her decisions, as they are literally just decided on the fly by us, the players. Not that it really matters in the game, because let's be honest, only one choice matters, and it's at the very end of episode 5. But I'll talk about that later. So now that I've gone on my self-indulgent tangent, let's move on with the story. After Chloe and Max arrive at the house, they chill for a bit and Max snoops around her room creepily while Chloe gets baked. Yeah, they make it a point that Max is nosy because they assume the player would be, but it's still pretty funny at times. The moving around and searching for stuff can be expected, but the one thing that's totally silly is the sitting and reflecting for a bit. No matter where she is, and no matter how insane the circumstances, there's a chance the game will allow you to just sit down somewhere and dwell on what's going on. It's incredibly awkward and mostly laughable, and I have no idea what they were hoping to accomplish by putting it in all over the place. Chloe's stepdad David, who happens to be the security guard at Blackwell, comes up to interrogate Chloe about missing one of his guns. This is because Chloe took it for her own protection against both Nathan and a guy named Frank, whom she owes a lot of money to. Chloe instructs Max to hide because she'd be in deep shit if David caught her up in there. For some reason. I mean, it's her childhood friend. I really can't see why this would be a problem. Granted, the one bad thing about David is that he is comically hard-ass. So yeah, he does get irritated. They really needed to tone that down. Anyway, it doesn't matter because you better come out when David catches weed in Chloe's room, otherwise Chloe will never ever let you hear the end of it. David does his typical bitching that you'll constantly hear the whole game. I guess Chloe and him are more alike than given credit, and then leaves. On to David. I did say I think he's a semi-interesting and okay character, because like Chloe, he's got good reason for being the way he is. Being a war veteran and a brand new father with a daughter who treats him like the scum of the earth,
so it's not too unreasonable that his attitude is heavily paranoid.
I think the game was trying to paint him as suspicious at several points,
but I really don't think he was fooling anyone.
David's simply too clumsy and inept for me to ever believe he could possibly be the culprit. He's just a big ol' tsundere, and I could never see him as anything more, even from this early on.
Afterwards, Max and Chloe sneak out and take a visit to the nearby lighthouse.
Max notices that the area they're in is very similar to the place she saw in her vision of the tornado. Of course, you find out by the end of the episode that the vision was no vision at all, but possibly a prophecy of the future. Or something. There's really nothing telling her that's going to happen for sure, but she believes it because she's pulled into this vision again for some reason. It's pretty dumb. But on to the interesting part of the plot, you find out that Chloe is actually in debt to a guy named Frank. In her eagerness to gather money, she tried to hook up with Nathan Prescott, assuming she would be able to make bank on the guy. Unfortunately for her, Nathan both drugged and kidnapped her for a brief period of time for unexplained reasons. It's in this scene that Max shows her true prowess as a voice actress.
Chloe, that is so fucked up. What did you do then?
Afterwards, the tornado business comes up and yada yada yada, which leaves Max having to explain to Chloe about her time manipulation power. This ends the episode, where honestly, barely anything happened really. I'm not sure why this game series chose to be episodic, as it's not like each episode has very much substance. To me, it's just a marketing strategy to sell a tease, which I guess works for some people. Basically, you don't know how the story is going to fully play out, so you're left to think about it and possibly make up your own theories. And in most people's cases that I've read, overthink about it. Honestly, if I had played this game one by one instead of the whole thing all at once, I would have felt pretty ripped off.
But yeah, really just an introductory/exposition episode, and not a whole lot more.
Episode 2 starts off the next morning as Max interacts with her fellow dorm mates once again. Also, you learn to not water her plant twice or it will die. Seems a bit overly fragile, and quite honestly feels like a lousy punishment for the player. I'm not sure why I even care about this, but I was pretty mad at the game designers when I figured this out.
It's not like Max pours a tremendous amount of water on it or anything, and yet apparently that's enough to drown the poor sucker. I don't know anything about botany, so maybe this is how plants work, but it just feels wrong for the designers to include, just because of butterfly effect.
Anyway, as Max engages in conversation with her fellow dorm mates, you discover a viral video has been going around that involves Kate Marsh making out with people from the Vortex Club. Really, author? Vortex Club? How unsubtle can this guy get? Which is hard to believe given her rather docile nature. Of course, she is bullied about this, which makes it up to Super Max to put a stop to it, because everyone else is worthless at doing anything. Well, not Warren, but basically everyone else. So you proceed to do some investigations by going and being nosy in Kate's room before conversing with her, which is kind of important that you be nosy because otherwise you won't know how to answer some of the questions you'll be asked later. It's just kind of goofy with Kate sitting there being emo and Max just going around snooping all over the place. Yeah, I know, video game logic. That's the last point of attack I'll use in the review. Kate's one of the characters I quite like, borderline my favorite. It's easy to sympathize with her as generally you get the impression that she's a good person, but doesn't have the strongest of heart. I think what made it for me was a scene where you encounter her later in Chapter 4, as that's my favorite scene in the game. Quite honestly, my main complaint with Kate is we really don't get to know her very well before shit hits the fan with her. I still like her and sympathize with her, but I can almost see someone not caring very much due to the limited interaction. Moving onward, you discover that once again Nathan was behind Kate's strange behavior in that video. Apparently she was drugged and brought to some location, much like Chloe. However, without any proof, there was no way to really pin the culprit as Nathan Prescott at the moment. So, unfortunately, I had to leave Kate in a state of distraught while seeking out more proof. Max proceeds to leave the campus and get on an incredibly dull and long bus ride. I have no idea why this is in the game, but I guess it's to contrast the view of the town from what you'll see in episode 5, but it's still so boring and dull. Maybe it's just a loading screen though.
Max then arrives at the Twin Whales, which is Chloe's mother's restaurant.
You do a bit more investigating on the circumstances surrounding Rachel Amber with the locals before finally sitting down to eat.
Chloe's mother informs Max that David isn't as much of a hard-ass as he seems to be, despite the negative light that both Chloe and Max see him in.
However, Chloe's stubbornness to be basically clung to the past and David's war days have made things difficult for him. Kind of makes you wonder why it's Max, but not Chloe, who was given these time manipulation powers. It would probably be more interesting and more symbolically meaningful. Well, whatever. Chloe eventually shows up and asks you to prove to her that your powers are indeed real. After doing so, you both decide to head out to Chloe's hideout.
Now, where of course Chloe has to be a big sloppy bitch is when Kate Marsh gives you a call, and if you choose to answer it, she once again gets extremely bitchy because you would dare pay attention to a girl in need. Of course I said go fuck yourself, Chloe, because really. I get there's actual reason that she's all uppity, but honestly, I think this scene was the downward spiral into the path of me just flat out hating her guts, as it's just like a 2-minute phone call. What's the big problem? You both head out to a junkyard where Chloe treats you like a little bitch and tells you to gather 5 bottles for her to practice shooting. I wouldn't judge this too harshly, but really, you have to basically do everything for Chloe from this point onwards, as she's almost incapable of solving or succeeding at anything, and usually at any puzzle sequence will stand around uselessly. I know it's gameplay, but making her proactive in these sequences could have served to make her a more tolerable character. Anyway, whatever, you let Chloe have fun with her gun for a bit. She tells you about her relationship with Rachel Amber, where she totally wasn't lesbian for her or anything, and then Frank shows up asking for his money. Of course he's acting like a bit of an asshole, so Chloe gets aggressive when she sees him sporting Rachel's bracelet on his wrist, as she's suspicious that Frank has something to do with her disappearance. When things seem like they'll get too violent, Max pulls a gun on Frank, informing him to back off. Here you're given the option to shoot or not shoot. And of course, typical of Chloe at this point, if you choose not to shoot like any normal person would, she'll bitch at you for not standing your ground. Yes, sorry Chloe, we can't all be Satan incarnate like you, so get working on that, okay? To be fair, she's a little more accepting of this and tells you she's glad it played out this way if you choose not to shoot. Frank takes your gun, and you proceed to follow up that situation by chilling out on train tracks, because you're both incredibly stupid. After talking a bit about Frank, lo and behold, Chloe gets her leg stuck on the tracks. I guess the designers wanted to put some extra drama and puzzle elements to make the episode more exciting, because other than the Kate segment, it's been pretty boring up until now. But geez, this feels so forced and stupid. After some fiddling around, you free her and Chloe explains that you're now bonded for life. But don't worry, she'll still make sure to bitch at you hardcore later on if you don't 100% take her side on everything. And even then, she'll guilt trip you for earlier actions. This is where a character's insecurity is taken to unbelievable levels. Bitch, I just saved your life. What more do you want Max to prove? After that silly fiasco, Chloe takes Max back to school. You can chat with a few students, but the main thing is you find Mr. Jefferson calling out Kate for actions on the viral video. Apparently, he believes her to actually be a bad girl in hiding and is just putting on a kind face, so he wants her to just come out with it. Thank you for making it incredibly obvious who the main culprit is at this point, Mr. Jefferson. Anyway, apparently this is the last push, as a few scenes later, Kate attempts suicide. Max tries to manipulate time, but unfortunately, because the writing told her so, she can't use it too much here, because apparently she used it too much that day, or something. See, because you're never told at any point how these powers work exactly, this just feels like a lazy way to make the situation more dramatic, which is completely unnecessary, because what could be more dramatic than someone committing suicide? But also, this is the only real time in the game when Max just can't use her powers despite being fully conscious. Yeah, I know the whole nosebleed thing foreshadows that they have a somewhat negative physical effect from overuse, but even in later episodes, it appears she can use them over and over as long as she's not about to pass out or something.
Whatever, you slowly make your way to the rooftop and confront Kate.
She explains that her life is ruined and everyone can only judge her now, so she has nothing left to live for. Following this, she presents to you a series of questions. As long as you answer them all correctly, she'll come down. But answer any wrong, and it's off the ledge with her. Obviously, I'm speculating many gamers just went on walkthroughs at this point to know how to save her, because, you know, we can't reverse time here in case we mess up, even though everywhere else in the game lets you. Well, I know I did at least. I'm not sure how the game plays out if you fail to save her, but I know it hardly matters by the end like said earlier, which made me quite angry because it felt like the game was just toying with my emotions here. But I guess I should give the game credit for making me care. Still, I do think we needed to interact with Kate more across these 2 episodes like said earlier, as the scene almost seemed like it came too quickly. But hey, Kate's likable, and I still cared, so I'll give it a pass. In the aftermath of this situation, the principal calls you, Mr. Jefferson, Nathan, and David to the office. They were all caught at some point doing something with Kate Marsh that could be considered suspicious, and it's up to Max to pin the one she feels is the most guilty at this point. Of course, this scene is basically just, who is the main culprit of this game?
which seems rather early to decide because it's only episode 2. If it's not completely obvious by this point, it's Mr. Jefferson who I ended up picking. See, David and Nathan are far too clumsy and obvious. They'd be caught easily if they were actually the culprit. Plus, the main reason is, of course, that Mr. Jefferson has the best actor of the three, which kinda gave him away early on. Anyway, I pinned the blame on him and he was no longer able to represent the Everyday Heroes contest, and thus, the episode is pretty much over, serving more as an investigative episode more than anything. Kind of boring overall, but the Kate segments were good enough. Episode 3 starts in the middle of night for a change as Max and Chloe plan to meet up so they can sneak into the school and gather more information about the case at hand. You're given slightly creepy ambient music as you walk through the halls, which I kinda liked, but I'm not sure why they were necessarily trying to make this section creepy. I guess it was just to keep the player on edge and make it feel like they could be caught at any moment, but considering we have Max's time manipulation power, it's not like you have to really worry about screwing up as he can just reverse mistakes, so it kinda defeats the purpose. After meeting up with Chloe, you find out that she was able to steal one of David's keys because, like said, this guy is incompetent as hell. I forgot to mention earlier that the reason Kate was able to get on the roof in the first place was because he forgot to lock the doors, which all seems rather unbelievable given his hard-ass paranoid behavior, but whatever. All in all, David just seems like a big loser in the game by this point. So you sneak in and try to break into the principal office. The door is locked, of course, so Chloe tries to show off her lock-picking skills, which of course fail because Chloe sucks. So it's up to you to find a way in. Well, sort of. Your friend/love interest Warren is actually the one who helps you find a solution to get in, as he's the only other competent person in the game besides Max. Actually, Warren's alright as a character in general, but it's too bad for him that Max has terrible taste and is totally lesbian for Chloe. Though as for the sneak-in sequence in general, it's one of the more creative puzzles, and I quite liked how it played out.
Whatever, you sneak into the office and gather a lot more information.
During this segment, you find donation money to a handicap fund that the school was raising, and Chloe wants to steal it to pay off her debt. You tell her no, and she'll of course guilt trip and bitch to you about it. I really don't understand how I'm supposed to sympathize with this girl at this point.
Heck, I don't even think Frank would stoop this low. I mean, maybe, but I kinda doubt it.
But afterwards, because Chloe's stupid once again, she wants to go for a swim in the school pool. Granted, I know it's because she thinks she has nothing to worry about because she has the protection of Max's time power, but this in general just makes her come across as inconsiderate and selfish. She's already seen twice now that Max's power give her nosebleeds and can make her physically ill from overuse. But this doesn't even seem to pass her mind because she feels that Max is just hers to abuse. I don't know if they were trying to make Chloe come across as a fun person, but more than anything, she just comes across as a rebel who just does whatever the hell she wants.
You're treated to some fan service and a totally not lesbian splash sequence before, of course, security comes in to investigate the disturbance the two of them have caused. So you're treated to one of the only 2 stealth sequences in the whole game, which once again is not nearly as tense as it should be because you have a convenient undo power. Of course, there's no way for them to actually catch you because of this, and the two make their way out. Max crashes at Chloe's place and also has a totally non-lesbian optional kiss moment the next morning with her. Following this is a rather touching scene between Max and Chloe's mom Joyce, the remnants of times long past, but of course Chloe comes down and ruins the moment by acting bitchy and whiny once again. So Max makes the tactical decision to go and investigate David's computer instead of dealing with any more of that nonsense. You find some of his reports which make it seem like he was suspiciously stalking Kate and digging up info on Rachel, but really, I can't imagine the game was trying to fool me into actually making me think that David could possibly be the culprit at this point. David shows up after you obtain the reports, pissed in the knowledge that 2 Blackwell students broke into the swimming pool last night. Of course, Chloe uses this opportunity to bitch even more and accuse him of being completely incompetent.
Which, in all fairness, she's right on point here. You're given the option to defend David or Chloe, and if you choose to defend David, well, I already knew what was in for me, so I just rolled with it. Moving on, Max informs Chloe that Frank is also a possible suspicious suspect because he apparently had a sexual relationship with Rachel Amber. They come into the conclusion to sneak inside his RV for any possible knowledge about Rachel's whereabouts.
Chloe tries to come up with a plan, but fails miserably at it before Max just informs her to leave it to her. So on a mission to get Frank's keys, you have to once again engage in dialogue with people in order to find the right thing to say to him. It's rather comical, actually, because if you screw up, he basically seemingly tries to kill you. This is kinda why I like Frank as a character. He's certainly willing to engage in criminal conduct, but he's also a guy whose every action isn't completely bitter and juvenile. It's just kind of nice, and he's painted in gray more so than any other character in the game. After enough fiddling around and trial and error, you manage to grab his keys from him, and Chloe shows her resourcefulness for once by being able to outsmart a dog. Gotta give her victories where I can, I suppose. They investigate the RV before finding out that Rachel and Frank were indeed in a more intimate relationship before splitting apart. And of course, Chloe is absolutely crushed by this betrayal and proceeds to be, well, Chloe. Even though the game does raise some self-awareness to Chloe's blatant immaturity, it doesn't do much to actually tackle it until pretty much the end of the game. But I'll get to that later. I mean, Jesus, she even blames Max right now for essentially nothing. Once again, bitch, she saved your life and is using her powers to help you despite it harming herself. But no, unless you bend over backwards for every whim, then that's just not good enough. Then all of a sudden, she spouts that she blames her dead dad for her problems, and, well, I just sort of stopped caring long before this point, to be perfectly honest. One thing the game kind of persistently will shove down your throat is that Max needs Chloe, which almost feels like an excuse to keep her around, and never really shows us why Max needs her, as she's perfectly competent to deal with most things on her own, and like said before, Chloe hardly helps at all, and usually just makes things worse. Finally, you get done with that awkward conversation, and you find Max at her dorm reflecting on a picture from her childhood of the two of them together. Unexplainably, Max actually warps back in time into the time period where the photo takes place by gazing at it really hard. Anyway, Max is now back in time in the period right before Chloe's father is caught in a fatal accident, so Max attempts to change the past by hiding his keys, preventing him from going out on the road. Another time warp happens and she returns to the present day as a consequence, and Max finds herself as part of the Vortex Club. And apparently, due to saving her father, Max has turned into a big bitch. At least until the her from the past cut up until this version of her, and yeah, it's a bit convoluted and confusing, and this is the problem with introducing us to random powers all at once. But the main thing that matters is that Max is desperate to check on Chloe's family, so she heads towards their home. Fortunately, she finds William still alive and well, but to Max's dismay, Chloe is now a paraplegic for some reason. And thus the episode ends. Honestly, I was a bit concerned that Life is Strange had jumped the shark and we weren't going to be tackling the core mystery anymore in favor of this supernatural bullshit. But thankfully, we're only in this timeline for a brief amount of time before things get back on track. I'm not sure if I would pin episode 3 or episode 5 as the weakest episode, but overall it just felt uneventful and boring, with way too much insufferable drama from Chloe. So episode 4 starts with Chloe and Max catching up. And you find that this Chloe has an almost completely different personality and behavior from the Chloe we've gotten to know. Apparently, when she was given a car, she had gotten into a terrible accident that had left her in this state. And now, not only is her family in massive debt due to the bills for her treatment, but also you learn that Chloe won't last much longer in this state. The acting from Chloe, William, and Joyce is completely stellar in this section, and it really blew me away. The only problem was that it felt all kind of random, but I guess in the long run it's just to paint the picture that changing the past doesn't always have positive consequences you might hope for. But I feel that maybe the designers felt like this would paint Chloe in a more positive light and make her more sympathetic, in which I would somewhat agree, but the thing is, this Chloe is still a much different person than the Chloe we got to know, like said before. The biggest mystery in this section is why did Chloe becoming a paraplegic make Max into a snobby girl? I guess we could argue that perhaps she couldn't deal with that stress, so she chose to run away from it entirely, but I don't know. But hey, I'm all for a little intrigue here and there. Moving on, you're treated to a few touching scenes before Chloe gives you the choice to end her life. Because she knows she doesn't have long and wants to end at a time when she's at her happiest, being by Max's side. A heavy choice indeed, that unfortunately, of course, doesn't really matter because no matter what you do, you just revert the timeline back to normal by going back to the photo again and letting William die. Felt a bit unnecessarily dramatic for something that essentially had no effect whatsoever. So you do that and you end up back in the normal timeline once again. Apparently, Chloe is all but calmed down now despite that incredible awkwardness from parting last time. You go downstairs, steal some more information from David, which leads you towards visiting a few people.
First off is Kate. Well, if you saved her. And like I said earlier, this is probably my favorite scene in the game. For once, Chloe acts strangely apologetic, which was nice to see. And Kate just warms my cold, black, cynical soul. I love the fact that she's gone back to drawing the way she used to, and that she also even tries to help you out despite recently having almost committed suicide and going through all this crap. It just makes you feel like you've really done a good deed. Well, you would, but she survives no matter what, but shut up, I like the scene regardless. Afterwards, you head back to the dorm and everyone is of course a little spooked by the Kate incident and the ongoing supernatural phenomenon. I haven't really discussed this, but don't worry, that's a whole other headache I'll just save for episode 5. Next up, Max has to sneak into the boys' dorm and break into Nathan's room. You find some creepy photos and files that help you piece together stuff later on. Before you leave, Nathan spots you, of course, but Warren basically goes full yandere and messes him up. Kind of ironic because Warren was the more docile type, and when he cracks, he gets violent. But on the flip side, Nathan was the aggressive type who gets docile when he cracks. This was pretty obvious from his introduction though, but it should be obvious to anyone after this scene that there is no way in hell he could be the main culprit if it wasn't already before. Max and Bitch then go to meet Frank, where you try to get the final bits of information you need in order to really piece together the mystery. During this section, you have to be really careful with what you say, because it's fairly easy to piss him off. You can even end up killing him and his dog if you're not careful. But thankfully, this isn't like Kate, and you're free to retry this section as many times as you want. I do think Chloe pulls her gun way too fast and handles the situation overall terribly. Granted, I get that she doesn't trust Frank, but geez, can this girl do anything right? Once you succeed at getting the information in whatever form, you head back to Chloe's house and piece together all the evidence you gathered so far. It leads you towards a farmhouse where of course you need to perform some arbitrary puzzle sequences, but hey, Chloe's actually useful here. She actually lets you use her like a stepladder. I do find the line funny here, sidekick at your service. Because that's really all she is at this point, isn't she? The funny thing about sidekicks is that they are rarely useful or even necessary, and really just serve to make the main hero look better. After solving all that, you make your way downstairs where you find yourself in the dark room. And here are more creepy photos of Kate and Rachel who have been drugged and wrapped up obviously against their will. They come to the realization that Rachel is probably more than likely dead at this moment because of how her photos depict her, which they uncover very shortly afterwards by going to find out where she's buried, and Chloe has a complete breakdown as a result. Though strangely enough, they don't take into consideration that Kate wasn't killed despite what happened to Rachel, which is kind of the final clue in the whole thing. Furious with anger, Chloe decides that she's going to kill Nathan as soon as she sees him, and apparently, rather than convincing her friend otherwise, Max just kind of goes along with this. It's kind of weird. Her plan is, of course... just kidding, she has no plan, which of course gets her killed later on. But for now, the two of them enter the Vortex Club's End of the World party, subtle author is subtle, as both of them continue to search for Nathan. Max of course goes to warn Victoria because there was a blank folder in the dark room with her name on it, informing the two that she must be the next target. She's actually fairly reasonable here. Well, more reasonable than Chloe at the very least, and takes heed to your warning only after a little bit of convincing. After confirming that Nathan doesn't seem to be at the party suspiciously enough, they leave and soon after get a text message from him to come to the junkyard. Of course, both fall for this obvious trap. Max gets stunned and Chloe gets shot, and lo and behold, it was Mr. Jefferson all along. Then the episode ends. This was easily my favorite episode in the entire series. The pacing was good all around, there was a lot of revelations, and it contained a lot of powerful emotional scenes. So what follows is, of course, my least favorite episode more than likely. Haven't decided if it was 3 or 5. Finally, we're at the end of the game with episode 5. Max finds herself tied to a chair in the dark room with Mr. Jefferson taunting her by revealing his true psycho nature. I give major props to the voice actor here because he really does his best to make this guy entertaining, but god, this guy is just so shallow. He's just your generic crazy guy killer whose gimmick is that he drugs you up and takes pictures of you. Though I'm somewhat grateful, as I thought rape would be a part of this story, so at least they were tasteful enough to not tackle that stick. The problem with Mr. Jefferson is that all the other characters in the story, even if awkwardly at times, had displayed some humanity of some form, while this guy is just a straight-up monster. He doesn't really have any motivation or depth other than he wants to capture the innocence of his models on film. He starts out a bit intimidating, but then just gets to be more laughable as the episode goes on. I almost might have preferred Nathan being the main culprit because he at least displayed some humanity that might have garnered a tad bit of sympathy from me, but either way, this is another one of those cases where the mystery was more intriguing than the actual answer we were given. Max manages to make him make the mistake of putting a photograph near her, and she's able to go back in time as a result. Max finds herself back to the day when the game first started. She sends a text to David informing him of the farmhouse and also gives Mr. Jefferson a picture for the Everyday Hero contest. Time jumps once more, and as a result, Mr. Jefferson is caught, and Max is seen flying off as the winner of the contest. And all's well that seemingly ends well. But of course, you know by this point that stupid tornado plot twist is going to rear its ugly head. Which it does, and so once Max hears about it, she decides she needs to tear up that photo that she entered into the contest so she can be in Arcadia Bay to support Chloe. Yeah, this episode gets really confusing really fast. So she tears up the photo, and lo and behold, she's back in the dark room with Mr. Jefferson, because he burned all her photos. How inconvenient. So I suppose she had no evidence to give to David or something. But yeah, you're taunted by Mr. Jefferson for a little bit longer, and then David shows up to save you. But he utterly fails at it, so you have to help him out. Need I remind you that David is a war veteran? Mr. Jefferson is a photographer! Why, oh why, is David so damn incompetent in this game? This whole scene really serves to make a joke out of him. After that struggle through trial and error, David's finally able to apprehend Mr. Jefferson. The two of you reconcile and he admits to being a screw-up and how much his family means to him. It's a bit touching actually, because even though he's a clumsy fool, at the very least you can tell he cares. Armageddon is happening outside, so Max rushes towards town in order to get a photo from Warren. Once you get there, you get his input on your powers finally, which of course you're not given much of an explanation because why would they bother trying to make the plot make any sense, eh? You go back in time once more where you have to confront Chloe and convince her to not go after Mr. Jefferson, as Nathan is already dead by this point. Basically, you have to make Max almost have a breakdown in front of her, and for once, she acts reasonably. Right at the end of the game, this allows Chloe to not be killed and for Mr. Jefferson to still be apprehended. And finally, all's well that ends well. Except of course for the giant tornado. After chatting with Chloe a bit, Max passes out and is forced into a nightmare segment where reality seems all messed up. This section is pretty creative and creepy at points, but when it tries to be all psychological, it's hard to take it seriously. I mean, the game has hardly been that psychological up to this point, so it's putting on the airs that it's trying to have some more depth than it really does, which was a bit jarring for me. Also, the stealth section was just hilarious, mainly because of Warren. Finally, all that nonsense is put to a stop, and Max has another breakdown, feeling like all she's doing is messing everything up. Chloe comes to the sudden realization that all this is happening because she was saved by Max on that very first time she used her powers. And the only solution to put a stop to the tornado and all of Max's torment is to just let her be killed by Nathan. Then you're finally given the only real choice that even matters in the game. Sacrifice Chloe or sacrifice Arcadia Bay. This choice was, of course, incredibly simple for me as Chloe was hardly likable. It's what she wants anyway, and well, the needs of the many outweigh the needs of the few and all that. But to be fair, to the people who did like her, just to get me in the right mindset for this, of actually being a hard choice, let me replace Chloe with, say, Kate. And then yeah, that would have been kind of awful. But still, it's more of a painful choice than anything, and it's obvious you would still have to sacrifice her, because I doubt either character, Chloe included, well, maybe, could actually live with themselves after sacrificing the lives of so many people. So yeah, you sacrifice Chloe, and yes, that's what works. A tornado was caused because a girl didn't die. Okay, it was actually caused by Max using her powers too much, obviously, but the effects being undone so simply is kind of weird. I mean, if it's caused by Max using her powers too much, then her going back in time shouldn't undo those effects that easily. I mean, Max is still affected and has a knowledge of the time shifting. See, that's a problem with not explaining the rules of powers earlier on. It means they work however the writer decides they work in order to create drama. I've been quiet about this, but I really hate the supernatural plot. From the snow to the whales to the friggin' tornado, it all comes across as desperate in something that should have just been a mystery with a time gimmick. Plus, it just feels like the butterfly was trolling Max by giving her these powers. Oh, the butterfly that caused the butterfly effect. The creativity is just stunning. I mean, she was given these powers and is punished for using them without any knowledge of any possible consequences. That's like punishing Spider-Man for using his spider powers by having a giant demonic spider come out and wreck the city as a consequence. In fact, even that makes more sense, as at least both those things relate to spiders. Time travel? Tornado? I don't get it. Plus, Max had the vision before she got her time travel powers. What could make her think that they're related? Anyway, it's much better for a character to use their powers after they have at least understood or at least acknowledged the consequences. For all we know, it just gave her a bloody nose and tired her out, which is fair enough. It makes the character's choices have a bit more weight to them rather than just being punishment for being completely ignorant on something absolutely no one has no knowledge of. Also, about the final choice. For some reason, Chloe is getting all self-sacrificial for Max's sake, which is nice, but it also comes out of nowhere if you ask me. To me, it would make more sense that she's willing to die because after Rachel died, she found she had no real reason left to live. If they wanted to make this part work, they really needed to give Chloe more of an arc, where she starts changing her attitude and her actions towards things, rather than springing it on us all at once. That way we could have felt actually really bad when we saw that this character was indeed improving, but still had to die. But all the way up until this point, she's mainly been a selfish, whiny bitch with only touches, and I mean touches, of okay moments. The episode should have focused more on Chloe and less on Max, if you ask me. Also, just as a final suggestion, I know I mentioned this earlier, that I'm sure no one will agree with either. I really do think this game would have been more interesting with Chloe as the person with the time powers, like I said earlier. Not only would this make her actually useful, but also flawed. But if Max was by her side, I doubt anyone would see her as useless or toxic, despite being an ordinary girl in comparison. I just think this would have created a more interesting and balanced dynamic. Anyway, the final bit that's really awful about this ending is that the ending makes it so all of our choices and decisions were pointless. Because no matter what, even if you failed to, say, rescue Kate, even if you accidentally got Frank killed, it's all moot because they'll be alive at the end. Some people say it helps shape Max as a character, but considering we're in direct control of most of her actions, Max is hardly much of a character at all, like I said earlier. Plus, it plays out the same way no matter what, killing any need for people to experiment or even replay the game. I don't think people were necessarily asking for too terribly much, not a million paths or anything like that, just that their actions meant something at the end of the day. If we could have forsaken this tornado plot twist, we could have had an ending where perhaps you felt bad for getting Frank killed despite the fact that you solved the mystery. You could have ended up with more friends and whatnot depending on whether or not you chose to get close to people. Oh, and that's another thing that's awful. Everybody's character development, outside of Max, is simply gone after this. This is from a game that is touted to have choices matter, and even on Steam, that's the main tag it has. All of that is nothing but a big lie, sadly. So in the end, Life is Strange was kind of entertaining, kind of charming, but certainly ends on a sour note. Though for $20, I do have to say my girlfriend and I got our money's worth out of it. It wasn't too terribly long either, so it's not like I was terribly invested in it, so my disappointment wasn't that high. It's just a shame that I didn't get more than simple popcorn entertainment.